first toy that I really loved was called Major Matt Mason, and that was like a 60s, 70s rubber bendy type of toy, and he's basically an astronaut. And as the toy line went along, they introduced various aliens and stuff. For me, it was just cool to have an astronaut figure, and luckily my parents indulged me and got me the little space station and stuff to play with. And then that dovetails into Christmas of 1973 when I first got my box of Bullmark kaiju from Japan. And it's at that moment in my life that toy-wise everything shifted, because the types of toys I was pulling out of that box were just crazy, looking aliens, and as I would call him, Melted Candle Man and Chicken Head Man. And they would just interact with my Major Matt Mason, because he didn't have that many aliens in his toy line, so it was cool to kind of like mash him up when I was playing. And they were playthings, right? I didn't approach them as like collectibles. I wasn't really precious with them. Later on, as I got older, I would put fireworks in some of my toys, my Bullmark toys, and blow them up, and use my Super 8 camera to film it. So it never really dawned on me like, this could be a rare toy one of these days, but I just enjoyed them for what they were. This is actually one of the first drawings I did of Izon in the potato patch, because he's a mutant potato. And then that's Max at the time. Like, according to my mom, I've always drawn since like the age of 2.5 or 3. And I actually have like a little scrawling I did when I was that young. So I've always loved to draw, and actually that comes from my mother's side. She was actually a very talented artist. Getting back to the vintage Japanese toys, another thing that attracted me to them other than the colors was the artwork on the header card and backing card of these figures. Amazing paintings and depictions of whatever was happening, the space guy fighting the kaiju, the monster. Of course, here's another thing is, I didn't call them kaiju because I didn't know that was the name back in the 70s. I just called them monsters, right? And so I would copy the header cards, I would do little drawings and cartoons. That's always been a part of me, is the art part, and I think it always will be. So flash forward, in terms of college, I didn't really know what direction to go to, so I went to our San Francisco Community College. Film was something that I thought, oh, that would be really cool, because of course Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and of course Lucasfilm is in this area. I'm in San Francisco. I started taking some film course, but I quickly realized that it's a very collaborative type of endeavor. You need a cameraman, you need actors, you need somebody to help with lights and do the sound and editing and all that. So it was a lot more complex. There's too many moving parts for me. So I was kind of a little bit wary about maybe becoming a filmmaker. Like, that wasn't quite where I was feeling like I was fitting. We had to make storyboards, which are essentially little drawings of each of the scenes that we think we're gonna film. I did this like really elaborate storyboard, and the teacher was like, you should probably go into art, not film. Like, I'm looking at your renderings. Have you been taking art classes? And at that point I wasn't. And so I thought, I draw, like I've drawn since I was 3. Like, that sounds like something I might like better than film. So that was sort of my pathway towards going to art college eventually. At that point, I knew that I wanted to become a commercial illustrator. I was open to doing like product illustrations, artwork, just basically be hired or paid to do art. And so as I was in school, I also picked up a thing called the airbrush. What I didn't realize is that the airbrush has kind of a stigma attached to it by some artists. Some of my teachers really tried to dissuade me from using the airbrush. And in retrospect, I think I understand where they're coming from in terms of sort of that bias. But at the time, that's the type of look I wanted to go for, and the types of artists that I looked at all used the airbrush. But to be honest, the airbrush is faster. And I knew if I was gonna make a career out of this, I couldn't spend like a whole month making one beautiful painting. I needed to really crank it out literally in a few days. I did have one really good teacher that encouraged me to keep up with the airbrush, Kazuhiko Sano, and he's most famous for doing the Return of the Jedi Star Wars poster. He really encouraged me, like he said, if you love this device, then really throw yourself into it. The other thing he taught me was to think out of the box. Did you ever try putting warm water, into the airbrush with your paints? Did you ever try, whatever, just like, even if it doesn't work, push that technique as far as you can, because you might develop, some other style or some kind of look that hasn't been done before. You don't know until you actually try, like Yoda, right? Do or do not. So anyways, I didn't see a point of continuing my education because I was getting so much pushback over the direction I was going in, and also I already had a portfolio. On a more personal side, my mom developed breast cancer. So my dad basically came to me and said, look, we think she should be okay, but we don't know. It's kind of time for you to, start working, right? Like, get out there. Now, I was always working, like I was doing shipping and receiving at Hold Everything. Prior to that, I was like a Safeway bagger back in the day. So I've always had some sort of, quote, real job, right, to appease my dad, who's very practical thinking. So I thought, okay, give me like a couple months. I'm gonna stop school, but I need to take my portfolio to New York, because that was the route. Like, you needed to get an agent in New York to take your portfolio on and help get you jobs. I was able to get an agent, which was great. Started my illustration career. I was able to do Goosebumps and paperback covers and, work with lots of great commercial clients. And my mom, was fine. She eventually lived to 94, so yeah, it all worked out. Yeah, in the 90s, once I had my illustration rep in New York, it was like a few years into it. Then he asked me, oh, have you heard of this book series called Goosebumps? And I kind of maybe did, but not really, because at this point, well, I didn't have any kids, but I was already in my 30s, and so I was not hanging out in the children's section of the bookstores. He said, oh, go check it out. And so I went and I saw them, and I thought, oh, these are like incredible covers. And he said, I don't know if this is possible, but I know the art director, and if you could do a sample, I think they're doing like a spin-off series that the main artist may not be able to, do both series. So they're looking for another guy. And I said, okay, fine. Like, I'll, let me do a sample for you. And so I painted a sample. There was no email, there was no social media or anything. So I had to like pack up the painting and FedEx it to him all the way in New York. Okay, so he'd get it overnight or, in about a day. He took the painting in to the art director, and amazingly enough, they loved it. They said, well, it needs a few tweaks if you're actually going to do the covers, but we can see you're capable of sort of doing that sort of creepy look. And yeah, I got like a sample gig, which was like the second issue of Give Yourself Goosebumps, which was like another second line. And luckily all the stars lined up, and I did that for like the next few years. As well as doing Goosebumps, I was also doing another series called Graveyard School, and then some other series, Spine Tinglers, and like the whole children's horror genre was like really big in the 90s. So that was really a fun time. I think I didn't realize the impact of Goosebumps at the time. Occasionally, like, one of my relatives would send me a little clipping and my cover would be on it, and it'd be like, kids go crazy over Goosebumps or something. But it didn't, sink in. I was just like, oh, that's cool. But I've got these deadlines, right? So I can't even think about it. I gotta just start painting the other stuff. But yeah, those were definitely more complex times. I think that probably led to a little bit of a burnout at some point after like 10 plus years of those kinds of deadlines. When we get sort of towards the end of my illustration career, it was a combination of the deadlines, never saying no because I was afraid that I wouldn't get another job, or there'd be a gap in, being employed because I'm self-employed. Once the program Photoshop came in, that had that slick kind of airbrush look to it, and that basically dried up like 50% of my work within 6 months. Because I used to do crazy things like just a simple gradation and get paid a few $1,000s for it. But now the art director could just click a couple buttons and get that same gradation in Photoshop, and it was just like, nope, didn't cost us anything, just like I could do it in-house. That was a transition point for me. I had a chance to like transition my work to Photoshop, i.e. digital, but I hated it. You know, I even took some classes just to kind of, you know, get up to speed on it. And I'm just not intuitive with the computer. I would much rather throw it into a physical airbrush and paint it and, you know, do hand stuff. And at the time, that's just not what they were looking for. So I knew the writing was on the wall. I knew that sort of phase of my illustration career was definitely slowing down. And then you combine that with just the burnout, and I knew, okay, it's done. I need to like reinvent myself and, you know, do something else. Yeah, so after I sort of wrapped up my illustration career, not sure what kind of direction I wanted to go into. You know, do I just maybe do fine art, you know, just kind of do my own stuff? But then in my head, I thought, okay, I now have my son Max, and I thought, oh, I should just start a toy company, and I'm gonna call it Max Toy Company. And then the light bulb went off in my head, and I started thinking, I'm gonna do, my first few toys I'm gonna do are gonna be based on like Ultraman and Spectreman, but they're gonna be my characters. So I'm gonna call it Captain Max, Alien Zam, which is Max spelled backwards, Kaiju Izon, and Kaiju Tripus, which is kind of like a Cthulhu looking character. That was the beginning of Max Toy Company. You know, those first toys were made in China. We did quite well. Luckily, I had several toy industry people who were able to help me out with production and distribution at the time. In the early Kid Robot days too, we were all sort of hitting a certain wave at that point. These types of weird, quirky toys being an interesting alternative, just the standard Mattel, Hasbro type of things. The shift from being an illustrator to becoming a toy maker, well, I don't know. I guess when I look back on it, everything was very seamless to me. I still draw and paint for my toys. Art has always been consistent through everything my whole life. So going back to when I was a child, admiring the artwork that was on the various toys, and then now I'm able to collect some of the artwork that were on the boxes and whatnot. I still love painting, I still love drawing, and even when I custom paint a toy, I approach it in sort of an illustrative manner, like I'm making a painting basically. It's not so much of a transition, but just a kind of configuring of what I'm doing to just a different platform. Now, in terms of how do I feel when, you know, people are buying or holding my toys, I want everybody to be happy. I don't want them to look at my toy in disdain. Sometimes I do get asked about giving advice to younger artists or people who are maybe transitioning from one career to the next. First, I have to say there's something in my personality that refuses to give up, and maybe this just comes from my parents and their experience, you know, of being interned during World War II. Nobody is gonna tell me what to do. You know, you can't be an illustrator, or no, you can't start a toy company. My recommendation is to not be so afraid that you never try something or you never do something, because then you've already defeated yourself. But maybe not be so blind that you just walk into it without knowing at least a little something about it. But as I tell my son Max, literally life is what you're doing now, so just try whatever you can. Some things may work, some things may not work. I used to do shipping and receiving for Hold Everything, and now when I mail out the orders, I'm essentially doing shipping and receiving. And then even when I was a bagger at Safeway, that's like customer service. Well, I do my customer service over email, right? Hey, I'll find your order, here's your tracking number, right? It all eventually kind of meshes together, and you just make do with little parts along the way, and that's kind of where you're at now.